There's one country that transformed a harsh and unforgiving wilderness into the greatest economic and military power the modern world has ever known. A nation whose flag became a symbol of hope, whose industries changed civilization, and whose cities rose from empty landscapes into icons recognized across the globe. For generations, the United States represented freedom, ambition, and unlimited opportunity. Millions of people looked toward America believing that just beyond its borders lay a future filled with possibilities. But hidden beneath that remarkable success is a question that few people ever stop to ask. If the United States became so strong, so prosperous, and so admired around the world, why did it eventually decide to build one of the most famous border barriers in human history? Most people imagine that the border wall has always existed, stretching across deserts and mountains like an ancient fortress. But the truth is far more surprising. There was a time when there was no wall at all. No towering steel barriers. No surveillance towers. No cameras watching every movement. In fact, for decades, the border between the United States and Mexico was little more than an invisible line drawn on a map. People crossed it every single day without imagining that one day it would become one of the most politically charged places on Earth. In the small border town of Nogales, life flowed almost effortlessly between the two countries. Families lived on both sides of the border. Children played together in the dusty streets. Shop owners welcomed customers regardless of which nation they came from. A person could wake up in Mexico, eat lunch in Arizona, and return home before sunset without thinking twice about crossing an international border. It was a unique place where two cultures blended naturally, connected by commerce, friendship, and everyday life rather than separated by fences or checkpoints. But history has a way of changing ordinary places forever. By 1917, the world had been consumed by the First World War. Although the battles were taking place thousands of miles away in Europe, fear began spreading across the United States. The American government became increasingly concerned about spies, smugglers, and the possibility that enemies could exploit its open southern border. Suddenly, what had once been viewed as a peaceful crossing began to look like a potential security risk. Soldiers were sent to patrol the border. Inspections became stricter. Crossing from one side to the other was no longer as simple as taking a walk across town. Most people believed these new security measures were only temporary. They were wrong. Then came the day that changed everything. It was August 27, 1918. The summer heat blanketed the streets of Nogales as merchants opened their stores and residents went about their daily routines. Nothing suggested that this ordinary morning would soon become one of the most dramatic days in the history of the U.S. Mexico border. What happened next remains one of history's greatest border mysteries. According to some witnesses, a Mexican civilian ignored an order to stop while crossing into the United States. Others claimed the misunderstanding was caused by language barriers. Some insisted that nervous soldiers overreacted. Still others believed that armed smugglers were responsible. Every version tells a different story, but they all agree on one thing. Someone fired a shot. Within seconds, the peaceful streets erupted into complete chaos. Gunfire echoed between buildings. American soldiers rushed to defensive positions while Mexican forces returned fire from the opposite side of the border. Civilians scrambled for cover. Horses bolted through the streets. Shop windows shattered. Thick clouds of smoke drifted above the town as terrified families hid inside their homes, uncertain whether they would survive the day. For nearly an hour, the border transformed into a battlefield. When the shooting finally stopped, lives had been lost on both sides. Soldiers and civilians lay wounded, and a community that had once lived together in relative harmony found itself permanently changed. Even today, historians continue to debate the events of that morning. More than a century later, no one can say with complete certainty who fired the very first shot. But one thing is absolutely certain. Trust had disappeared. And when trust disappears, walls begin to rise. Not long after the Battle of Ambos, Nogales, officials decided that the open border could no longer remain as it had been. The solution was surprisingly simple at first. Workers installed a basic wooden fence supported by rough posts and strands of barbed wire. It was not tall. It was not impressive. In fact, Many people assumed it would eventually be removed. Instead, it became the beginning of something much larger. That modest fence represented far more than wood and wire. For the first time, the border became something people could actually see and touch. It was no longer just a line printed on maps. It became a physical reminder that two neighboring communities now lived under different rules, different governments, and increasingly different futures. Families who had visited one another freely suddenly faced inspections and delays. Local businesses that depended on customers from both countries struggled to adapt. Friends who had once crossed the street to meet for dinner now needed permission to enter another nation. Life continued, but it was no longer the same. As the decades passed, the fence continued to grow. New political tensions, economic crises, organized crime, illegal trafficking, and rising immigration all contributed to demands for stronger border security. What had started as a temporary precaution slowly evolved into miles of reinforced barriers, steel fencing, surveillance technology, floodlights, drones, and one of the most heavily monitored borders anywhere in the world. For many Americans, the border became a symbol of national sovereignty and the government's responsibility to protect its citizens. For many Mexicans, it became a painful reminder of separation and lost opportunities. To others, it represented both ideas at the same time, a barrier designed to provide security while also dividing communities that had once lived almost as one. Perhaps that is why the history of the U.S. Mexico border continues to fascinate people around the world. It is not simply the story of a wall. It is the story of fear overcoming trust, of politics reshaping ordinary lives, and of how one decision made in a small desert town echoed across generations. Today, millions of people legally cross the border every year for work, business, education, and family visits. The connection between the United States and Mexico has never truly disappeared. It has simply changed. Behind every section of steel, every checkpoint, and every surveillance tower lies a forgotten story that began with a quiet town, a single gunshot, and a fence that no one believed would change history forever. And perhaps that is history's greatest lesson of all. The world's most famous walls rarely begin as walls. They begin as temporary solutions that slowly become permanent.